Why do you need this video in the AI era? You still have to have a conceptual understanding in your mind and some terminology to be able to make a prompt. You are too lazy to read, so you can watch me, hit like and subscribe for more. Now, I will tell you how you can implement SAML SSO at your project. The single sign-on is an authentication method allowing users to log in with one set of credentials to accept multiple independent applications. And the Security Assertion Markup Language, SAML, is an open standard protocol used for securely exchanging authentication and authorization data between an identity provider and a service provider. In other words, SAML is one of the options to implement SSO. It's a rather strict protocol of interaction between the thing that authenticates users and the thing that is going to be used. It's an enterprise-level solution, so you can expect XML, data encryption and signature validation. Nowadays, it's fashionable to build micro SaaS applications, and any paid application needs to have an authentication in place. Let's say there is an enterprise client that is buying micro SaaS applications. The IT department doesn't want to manage over 9,000 employee accounts across all those SaaS applications, and employees will not feel comfortable with the ton of credentials. The solution is to use the company's authentication mechanism and just tell the micro SaaS solutions that the user is legit. It's quite a common case, that's why SAML comes into place. Let's agree on the terms we are going to use next. An identity provider is a service usually managed by the client, the company in my example, which holds the client user's directory and is capable for authenticating these users. As an example of solutions, Okta, Azure Active Directory and Google Suite. In other words, it's a thing that can tell us that the user is who is claiming to be. I will be calling it IdP next. Service provider, micro SaaS from my example, is a service that provides a service and needs to know from the identity provider the user identity. I will be calling it SP next. JIT, or just-in-time provisioning, is a process in which the service provider creates or updates the user record in its own database from the SAMLResponse. It's very handy for new user creation in a SaaS database, as the process happens on login. As we have authorization in place, the identity provider can pass not only the user ID in the response, but the user group and user role. Service provider will have to map IDP's roles in groups into its own permission layers. SAMLResponse is a redirect payload sent as a post form together with a user from the identity provider to the service provider in case of successful user authorization. SAMLResponse is a base64 encoded XML document of strict structure, which holds SAMLRequest ID, user ID, identity provider signature, IDP issuer, destination, the place where user is going to be redirected after sign-in, additional data configured on the IDP side, such as user group. SAMLRequest is the content of the user redirect payload. User is redirected from the service provider to identity provider together with the SAMLRequest payload. Depending on the identity provider binding configuration, it can be a GET redirect or a post form submission. SAMLRequest is a base64 encoded. Depending on the binding, it can be inflated XML document containing the request ID, service provider audience ID, destination, possibly signature, depending on the identity provider configuration. Bindings define how SAML messages, most usually SAML requests, are transported between the service provider and identity provider. Usually, SAML request is an HTTP redirect binding GET. In this case, SAML request payload gonna be inflated to make the query shorter. But it can be configured on the identity provider to be an HTTP post binding as well. Usually, SAMLResponse is expected to be an HTTP post binding. It means the user is redirected with a post form submission. Right, you are a micro SaaS and you are lucky to subscribe multiple enterprise clients. Now you are one of their tools, so you have to support multiple clients, which means multiple identity providers. It's called multi-tenancy. It brings us to two SAML authentication scenarios: service provider initiated authentication and identity provider initiated authentication. Service provider initiated authentication is a scenario when the user jumps to your SaaS login page and enters their email. With the user email, you have to identify the corresponding user company and dynamically use that company SAML credentials. If you are identifying users by the domain, you might want to have a domain verification mechanism. Let me know if you want a video on how to do it. In case of identity provider initiated verification, your client has a grid of applications just like yours, and their user can click on your application logo to be immediately redirected and logged in to your application. In fact, it's receiving SAMLResponse without previously made SAML request. In order to get the identity provider's configuration for that SAML response, you will need to parse from the SAMLResponse XML the identity provider issue ID. By the issuer ID, you can find the client with its SAML configuration. SAML SSO is just tossing XML all around, and you can make it by yourself or with AI, but I strongly suggest two libraries. First of all, you will need to mock the identity provider for development. The easy way to go is to use MockSAML. I will share the link in the description. You can run MockSAML locally or in Docker. You can easily modify the source code to support your custom domains. With MockSAML, you can test both scenarios: service provider initiated and IdP provider initiated authorization. To build MockSAMLRequest and validate SAMLResponse, you can use the battle-proven Node.SAML package. It's an old and used as a subdependency in multiple well-known libraries, such as Passport SAML. Now, when we have everything set up and have an understanding of the key parts, we can take a look at how it works all together. I will illustrate the most common and simple flow. Please let me know in the comments if you need another video with the advanced cases. So, user enters the service provider webpage and sees the login form. User enters an email and hits login with SSO button. Your backend gets the SAML configuration from the user's email and reply to the browser with the redirect URL to the identity provider page with a SAML request in the query parameters. SAML request contains request ID and post-login destination, user redirect destination. They will be validated in the SAMLResponse validation. Important to know that Node.SAML introduces its own interface for single-time request ID tracking. Then the user is redirected to the identity provider login page. The user enters their identity provider credentials. If the credentials were correct, the user via the post form submission is redirected back to the service provider together with the SAMLResponse payload. Service provider using the Node.SAML validates the SAMLResponse validity. It checks SAMLRequest ID, identity provider signature, identity provider issuer, and destination. If everything is valid, service provider can consider the authentication successful and give the user a service provider level session token and redirect to the destination. The identity provider initiated flow is the same except for the request ID. It's just going to be missing. Important to remember that the SAML X509 certificate is rather confidential and is better to be stored in an encrypted storage, such as AWS Secret Manager. Yes, MockSAML is a clumsy solution indeed. It's completely uncomfortable for the developers, but after all, it's comfortable for the enterprise-level company account management. All this fuss just to get a signed user, and yet so far you still have to have your own user session solution, such as cookie or JWT token or whatever else it could be. SAML is the price to pay if you want to work with the enterprise companies. Stay secure and see you in the next video. Bye.